and Black student enrollment at these 101 colleges. We looked at really access. How has access changed since the year 2000 at these institutions? And the way we do that is by comparing the number of Black and Latino students at these institutions to the percent of Black and Latino 18 to 24-year-olds in the state. We do this because we think these institutions should be representative of the state population. And so if you have a percentage, if you have 10% of Black 18 and 24-year-olds in the state, we would expect to see your institutional enrollment be 10% Black students at the institution as well. And so we use that as kind of a benchmark to really measure the institutions. And then we do one of the things that institutions and states hate is we grade them on how well they've done in terms of providing access. And so we give letter grade, A through F, letter grade to these institutions, really pushing them on how accessible they are or are not. Why selective colleges and universities? We know that in schooling, resources matter. And selective colleges and universities in states, you just have more funding. We fund them differently. We fund them better than we're funding community colleges, and we fund regional publics. They have more resources. And we know that because they have more resources, a lot of times students who attend these institutions are more likely to graduate. They're more likely to get support. They're more likely to go on because of the social capital that's created by attending these institutions. They're more likely to go on and hold influential positions. We also know that these selective institutions don't admit enough students who are Black, Latino, or from low-income backgrounds. They need to do a better job in providing access to the students who would most benefit from those institutions. And then finally, these institutions, because they're public, are tax-paying institutions supported by Black, Latino, low-income taxpayers. And so if they're using tax dollars, they should be accountable to look like the state that they're taking those tax dollars from. The high-level findings of the report, and we'll dig in a little bit more, but the high-level findings of the report is that we've made very little progress since the year 2000. A majority of the schools that we examined are inaccessible for Black and Latino undergrads. Over half of the institutions receive D and F for access for both Black and Latino students. And sadly, Black students have less access today than they did in the year 2000. So access for Black students has actually gone backwards. And while we see improvements for Latino students, I would say most institutions could have only moved in one direction. It still falls short of what we're seeing in terms of state demographics. So it's a better story for Latino students, but it's like there was only one way for these institutions to move, and that was to improve, and they still haven't improved enough when we look at the specific findings for each group of students. So when we think about the findings for Black students, one of the things we see is that over 75% of these colleges received an F grade for their representation of Black students. When you think about collectively the institutions that received F and Ds, over 83% of institutions received an F or a D in terms of their representation for Black students. When we look at the A grades, the opposite end of the spectrum, only 1 out of 10 or 9% received an A grade. And one of the things that for us was truly troubling is that institutions in states with larger Black populations were actually the least accessible. When you think about nearly all of the 32 institutions in the 14 southern states, which account for over half of the nation's Black population, received failing grades. Black students in the South are not getting access to selective public institutions, and that from our perspective is a function of the system that's been set up in K through 12, but also in how schools are looking or evaluating students and recognizing merit in recognizing merit in their admission system. You know, when we looked at the institutions, almost 60% of the institutions that have decreased since the year 2000, you know, it was really troubling to see that at a lot of these institutions, the decreases were significant. And at the 42% of institutions that actually increased their share of Black students, for the majority of them, they increased by less than 2%, 2 percentage points or less. So those institutions that increased the share of Black students since the year 2000, it was a very minimal increase in terms of the number of Black students. And so for even those that were, you know, I would say are, you know, doing better, they didn't do better by much. They increased their percentage of Black students by less than 2%. A lot of people will claim that it is a function of state demographics. And so we looked at the demographics, and in over 50% of the states, the institution's percent of Black and Latino students decreased, this is for Black students, decreased, and the state's percent of Black residents increased. So we have an inverse relationship, right? The percent of Black folks in the state is going up while the percent of Black students at the institution is going down. And so for institutions to claim that, you know, the percent of eligible Black students has gone down, the percent of Black residents in the state is going up. We would expect there to also be an increase in the enrollment of Black students, and we're not seeing that in over 50% of the states. When you think about institutions that are on the opposite side, and it's over a quarter of these institutions, percent of Black students increase less than the state share of Black residents increase. So even those states that are increasing, they're still not increasing compared to the share of the folks in the population. So they continue to under-enroll Black students, even within those states or those institutions that have done better. When we look at the findings for Latino students, it's a little bit of a different story, but like I said before, you know, you have to take it in context. Most institutions were enrolling very few Latino students. And I think that when we look at attainment for Latinos in the United States, you know, approximately 22% of Latinos in the United States have an associate's degree or higher. You know, attainment for Latino remains very, very low compared to the broader population. And so most of these institutions could have only moved in one direction. The problem is that even when they moved, not enough moved. And so when we look at, you know, the slide, nearly half of the colleges received an F grade for their representation of Latino students. And then if you include Ds, and that we're well over, you know, we're well over 60%. And so most of the institutions, these selective institutions, are failing. Just 1 out of 7 received an A. And so even for those that were doing well, even among those that were doing well, you know, they still, like, in our opinion, in terms of the demographics, still weren't doing enough. The institutions in the 9 states with 75% of the nation's Latino population were on average less accessible. So think about this. These are like California, Texas, Florida, 27 of the 37 institutions, New York, Illinois, these are the states that are in that group. But 27 of the 37 institutions received Ds and F grades. And so even in the states with the most Latinos, these institutions still aren't enrolling a representative share of Latino students. When we looked at how much these institutions had increased, like I said, 100% of the institutions increased. I would argue that they only had one way to go because enrollment was so low. The vast majority, so, you know, 50%, over 50%, if you look at the green and the gray bars, increased then 5 percentage points or less. And so, you know, the great majority did not increase at the rate of the growth of the population in that state. You know, in more than half of states, the growth exceeded 5 percentage points, and in a smaller percentage of states, it actually increased by over 10 percentage points. But when you look at the percentage of Latino student enrollment increase at the same rate as the the number of Latino residents in the state increase. The argument here is that in 65% of the institutions, the growth was less than the growth in the state's Latino population. So even for all of these institutions that have made gains, the gains are not sufficient to keep up with the gains of Latino residents in that state. And so the states are not keeping up in terms of enrolling Latino students when you think about the state population overall. So what would these institutions, or collectively, what would these institutions have to do? On our site, you could actually go and look at the directly for your state, at the institutions in your state, how many more students they would have to enroll. But when we looked at this data, if Latino and Black enrollment at public selective four-year institution match the state demography, among Black students, these institutions, these 101 institutions, would need to enroll over 192,000 more Black students. That would be a percentage point change of 166%. And if they were representative of the Latino residents in the state, they would need to enroll nearly 183,000 more Latino students, a 70 percentage point change. And so when you think about representation and who is getting into these institutions, these leaders have a long way to go in terms of achieving some level of representation of the populations in the state that they find themselves. And so I'm gonna kick it over to Jordan to walk us through the recommendation.
Yeah, thanks, Will. So, I mean, these numbers are pretty just haunting, right? And but there are recommendations that we have on how institutions, states, and the federal government can all take action to help increase access for Black and Latino students. So getting us started, what can colleges do? First simple thing is adopt goals to increase access for Black and Latino students specifically. We see colleges and universities doing this all the time when it comes to recruiting more out-of-state students, recruiting athletes. There's been an increase in universities increasing or putting goals to increase enrollment of low-income students. We are just challenging these institutions to in turn put that same emphasis on when it comes to race and access for Black and Latino students. And colleges and universities, when they set these access and attainment goals for their enrollment, they have the resources to see that through. So that's a very simple initial piece. Another area that we recommend is increasing access to high quality guidance counselors. This means counselors that are trained in the history of racial inequities in our country and are trained in access in higher education. So that's a role that both the K-12 system and the higher education system can work together to build that. It's important for both of these systems to commit to this and make sure that there's no longer the fact that students often have access to police officers in their schools, but not guidance counselors. In fact, 1.7 million students in schools right now have police officers, but no guidance counselors. And that's a very easy, attainable goal to reach. Also, universities can rethink their recruitment strategies. It's been shown oftentimes that colleges fail to recruit from their local high schools, which serve more Black and Latino students on average. Looking closer to home is a simple place to start. And while we're looking at recruitment, the role of standardized testing can also be altered in the college admissions process. Colleges should consider making standardized tests optional and try to reduce the emphasis of these tests on admission. Tests like the ACT and SAT have been proven to be great at predicting income, which means that students with the most resources do really well on these tests, but they aren't a strong predictor of whether a student can be successful in college. there is evidence that grades and a look at the actual courses students take are much stronger predictor of success in college. And an overemphasis on these tests creates more barriers for students, particularly Black and Latino students. But the good news is colleges have a chance to learn from this, because with the pandemic, many universities have committed to going test optional temporarily. So hopefully these institutions can see the impact this change has on access and the success for students that are enrolled. So we also don't want to think about criteria we take away without also addressing those that we can add in college admissions. And our guidance is to actually look at race specifically. Thinking about the racial makeup of a university class and the institution as a whole is an important step that universities can take. There's obviously a national conversation around using race in admissions, and it's an issue for the states to address as well. We encourage states to remove bans that they have on affirmative action, because these bans can signal to institutions and institutional leaders that their efforts to target and support access for students of color are prohibited. Right now, there are 9 states that have a ban on affirmative action. Most recently, Idaho, just in March, initiated a ban, but we're also seeing on the counter side states having active campaigns to repeal such issues. In California, that's on the ballot right now. Yes, shout out to California Prop 16 in the chat. So it's just important that this is always part of the conversation, and that's a role that both states and individual advocates can play in getting that issue as a higher priority. States and institutions also need to increase financial aid to Black and Latino students. For example, white families have 10 times the wealth of Black families, which means that there are fewer resources to fill the gaps to pay for college and full cost of attendance. Recognizing that there is an economic crisis right now, that means that the way states spend their dollars is more important than ever. States are going to need to make sure that they're making tough calls and prioritizing students that need these funds the most. Public institutions have spent at least $32 billion on financial aid between 2001 and 2017 on students that lacked financial need. So it's really about reprioritizing and reallocating those resources. And a lot of times those financial aid dollars are being determined by test scores. And so it brings us back to that, putting less reliance in that area. We talk a lot about enrollment and completion, but it's also important to look at the experience students have while attending university. So we have to address campus racial climate. Poor racial climate can negatively impact students' academic, social engagement, completion, and sense of belonging at a university. And that can't go unchecked and unnoticed. And for too long, these issues have been isolated in student affairs, when we really also need to see the consideration in what's happening in the classroom, recruitment and retention of diverse faculty and staff, courses that address and represent the diverse experiences and contributions of Black and Latino communities. All of these things can impact student experience and retention. Finally, we need entities to hold these institutions accountable. So at the state level, states have the opportunity to craft policy to support increased access and enrollment for Black and Latino students. An example of that, outcomes-based funding policies in distributing dollars based on the priorities that matter to them is a way to do that. We suggest that colleges should be held responsible for increasing access to Black and Latino students, meaning that there are greater funds for colleges committed to doing this and fewer funds to those who don't. States are already doing this for low-income students in many cases and need to show that same commitment to race. Some states that have made that commitment include New Jersey, Louisiana, and most recently Colorado. Also, the federal government provides funding for higher education, and in exchange for that funding, they should expect more from colleges. That's not a new idea, but too often that conversation is limited to student success and outcomes and not access itself. The data presented today proves that there is also a need to target providing access to Black and Latino students and perhaps limit funding for colleges that include that. This doesn't cover all of those recommendations, but the report dives deeper. But those are some of the top line things that are attainable and we really recommend happen at all levels of advocacy. I'm going to stop right there so we can have some time for questions and thoughts from you all. Opening it up.
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can go back to the regular Zoom screen. But I did want to say just two things real quick. One, we know that by simply going test optional, that doesn't always impact equity unless you change other structures. So if you go test optional, but you don't change any of your other admission requirements, you're not going to have a different outcome. Because we know that Black, Latino, and low-income students go to schools that have less AP courses, or they have less access to IB or dual enrollment courses. We know that some of the other things that are valued in admissions are things that low-income students and students of color don't have access to, like extracurriculars. Do you do it, nationally or globally? And all of these things are opportunities that a lot of times are denied low-income students and students of color. And so unless we change some of those other structures, going test optional in and of itself isn't going to change access. And then the one other thing I was going to say is, we could have put this as a recommendation, probably should have, but these institutions, if they're going to address climate, they also need to diversify the faculty and staff. Without diversifying faculty and staff, as a student, you go and you don't see anyone reflect over yourself. And I know this is the conversation in the K-12 space, and it should be, I think, a more pronounced conversation in higher ed as well. I know there's some questions, Jordan. I don't know if you want to start tackling these.
Yeah. Are there some things that universities and colleges did that increased enrollment for Black and Latino students in the schools that received A's and B's that perhaps wouldn't have received those grades previously?
Yeah. Interesting. We talked to a couple institutions that received A's, and the two institutions were the University of Albany and University of Central Florida, and both of them, University of Central Florida received a B+ for Latino students, but they went from an F to a B, and so we were very curious. And University of Albany also, improved their ranking significantly since 2000, and we found that they actually generally did three things. Number one, they invested and created pipeline programs. So at the University of Albany, they had the EOP program. They were deeply invested in it. It was a part of the culture of the campus. There was recruitment, but not only was there recruitment, then the folks who were recruiting students, Black students, then went on to become like advisors on the campus for those students. At the University of Central Florida, they were doing it through a transfer pipeline. They actually had a project that was at community colleges. And what they had former students who were recruiting and providing students kind of with that social capital, the college knowledge from community college into the transfer at the University of Central Florida. So that's the first thing they were doing. The second thing is they were using data to hold their colleges accountable. So at the University of Albany, they were giving equity gap data to the college, and then allowing the college to develop their own plan to try and close those gaps. And so they were, I think, doing an excellent job of using data to identify gaps and then attempt to close those gaps. And then the third thing I would say is that at both of these institutions, they were very engaged in using student voice to improve how they were engaging students. And so, at the University of Albany, students had issued some complaints about what was happening at the institution. They actually posted all of those online, and then they started letting students know how they were addressing students' concerns in those complaints that they issued. And so, we saw folks like be engaged around it, and truthfully, it has to be a priority of the leader. We see this, all the time. Those schools, in K-12 that have the best outcomes, a lot of time have the best leaders. They have good principals, they have good superintendents, and it's true at university as well. Institutions will care about diversity and equity if the school president cares about diversity and equity and makes it a priority.
Thanks, Will. I think that actually ended up touching on another question in the chat, so perfect timing. How can increasing and improving policies for transfer students help increase access?
I mean, we know that a large percentage of low-income students and students of color start at a community college because of the affordability issue. And so, if we streamline pathways from community college, and then you're going to have, that's exactly the strategy that UCF adopted. They said there's a lot of Latino students at the community college. Let's use that as a pathway. And so that is a very real strategy. I would say there are a lot of challenges with that, just because faculty would argue that, some faculty would argue that you're, by taking this course from community college, you're actually infringing on their academic freedoms, because they teach the class differently, even if they use the same book. And so there are serious issues around transferability of credit. GAO did a report a couple of years ago that showed that 42% of students' credits actually doesn't count on transfer. And so when almost half my credits, if I start at community college, don't count towards my major, and then I'm repeating a bunch of classes, it becomes this double expense for a student who went there trying to save money in the first place. And so, I think we need to streamline transfer. I think there needs to be federal mechanisms, truthfully, put in place that require institutions take credit, especially if they're accredited from the same body.
Thank you, Will. Folks, we still have a couple minutes, so feel free to keep typing questions or, flags, comments into the chat.
I thought I saw a question around counselors.
Oh yes, around funding for counselors.
Yeah, the high school counselor challenge is a very real challenge. There was some federal legislation, a couple introduced 2 years ago, that would tie some federal funding to states, kind of like Title I funding, but for school counselors. And so I know there have been, there's been federal legislation introduced. It didn't get very far, but I know that this is something people are thinking about. I would say the same things we argue about teachers, that we need to change teacher training. We also need to change how we're training school counselors. I have a master's in school counseling, and I'll say that there was very little done around college counseling or advising. There was one class, and I knew more than the faculty member who was teaching it, because I worked in admissions and financial aid my career. And so, I think that we also need to look at that. If you have a school counselor who lacks, any ability to work with, low-income students or students of color, there was some really good research out of Massachusetts recently that showed that having a same-race counselor also impact the same way having a same-race teacher impacts outcomes by the third grade. Having a same-race counselor also has significant impact. So there is some federal legislation. We'll see if anything moves in the next year or so, but I think it's going to be tough.
Thank you. And it looks like just going to highlight something that Steve Smith from Washington shared, that Washington State just passed a bill to add funding for counselors with the requirement they send a higher percentage of their time in direct work with students, which is great. I'm wondering, Steve, if you want to type in the chat or unmute, do you know if, you know, what the efforts were that went into getting that passed? Was that, was there a lot of support for that, or was it a difficult process?
While Steve types that in, I do want to address Angel's question around A through G requirements in the high school districts. You know, there's been a lot of, I'm from California originally, and there's been, I would say, a lot of arguments around making A through G a high school graduation requirement. You know, I think it's, I personally think it would be a good thing. EdTrust West, our colleagues at EdTrust West have done some research on this, and they found that most of the high schools that serve majority low-income Latino and Black students don't even have the full range of A through G courses. And so I think we should start by offering the courses at the schools where Black and Latino students are enrolling at. Part of the reason that percentage may be so low in that district is because the schools, they're just not offering them. We know there's some data from Civil Rights Collection a couple of years ago that showed that majority minority schools had less access to high-level math and full range of science courses. And so if we are going to make it a high school graduation requirement without providing the courses, what we're going to do is effectively or likely increase dropouts or students who don't graduate on time. So, you know, I think that it probably is good to do, but it needs to be paired with additional resources and supports so that those schools can actually provide those courses to students. There was another question around if secondary schools play a role in this problem. You know, I think it's an institution-specific problem. These institutions, and part of it is a function of funding, right? You know, I argue with folks. I work for the UC system and University of California system, and when these institutions, when state funding started decreasing, these institutions adopted a strategy to increase the number of international students that they had at those campuses. Every single one of these institutions increased had double-digit, triple-digit increase in the number of international students. Explain to me how at the same time did these same institutions then shrink their Black student enrollment, right? They had a strategy in place to increase international student enrollment. Some of the research has shown, and Jordan touched on changing recruitment practices. Some of the research has shown that these flagship institutions are recruiting at higher income and wider schools. And so there's an intentional strategy on behalf of these institutions to actually increase international student enrollment, increase out-of-state enrollment from students that are richer and wider. But there isn't an intentionality on behalf of these institutions to increase the number of our Black or Latino students. Sometimes it happens as a function of demographics, but at most institutions, I would say it's not a part of an institutional strategy to try and increase Black student representation or Latino student representation. So I think K-12, there's a component that K-12, I think, plays, but I think these institutions have a lot of blame, in and of themselves.
I also just want to note, we didn't dive too deep into this for today, but in terms of utilizing this report and its findings in kind of advocacy efforts, I also just want to highlight the importance of bringing student voice into this. Students are playing a huge role on their campuses in addressing campus racial climate and addressing, you know, curriculum issues. And I think arming students at universities with the information on these huge access gaps is really important for them to be addressing while they're at these universities, and telling institutions what they see as what they want to see on their campus and the community that they want to create. So I just want to kind of add in the importance of that student voice into this work.
You know, one other thing I kind of wanted to say, and Natasha actually provided a good flag on this, is that these states or these schools can actually make, for example, A through G the default, so but allow students to opt out of it. And so if it's the default, if A through G was the default, and then all students would be on track, a student could opt out. But if you required it and made students opt out instead of opting in, you may increase the number of students who are eligible. One of the other things, I don't know if there's anyone from Louisiana joining us, but one of the things we've seen be effective in increasing access, because students are concerned about cost, is creating FAFSA as a high school graduation requirement. You can't just make it a requirement and not provide supports at the school level. So tell the students, figure this out. Louisiana did it and then provided additional supports. And so they've actually closed gaps at schools in terms of students who were completing the FAFSA or not. There's also an opt-out function. I've been very concerned about that, especially for undocumented students, but that's something that states can do. California has a bill right now, has had a bill that didn't move, but we know that it's actually state law in Texas, Illinois, and Louisiana right now.
I know we only have a few minutes left, so feel free to type any last questions into the chat. I do want to flag, in terms of follow-up, we flagged this in our invitation, but all the recordings from all of the sessions will be shared with participants, as well as you'll receive a Dropbox of all of this information. You'll get this report in whole. We'll have little one-pagers that for this report in particular for your state that show you the numbers for your state and the schools that were covered. And so I just want to flag that you'll get all of those resources in follow-up, and we hope that you're able to use them and stay in touch with us. One last note before we jump out of this is to please return to the Hopin platform to attend your next breakout session. There's also state team time later today, and we really, really, really want to make sure that folks stick around through the end of the day to hear from Congresswoman Presley and Ed Trust President John King. So with that, we'll see you in another session, and we look forward to continuing to partner in all of this work. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. See you guys.